left, I mean the academic world, which is synonymous with saying the left, has mostly ignored her. They mostly tried they penalized students for even mentioning her name, and then when she comes up, they mock her. The right-wingers, the conservatives, they're condescending, really. They're just, you'll hear them say stuff like, oh yeah, sure, her books when I was a teenager, awesome. They don't want to debate her. I'd like to see objectivism be challenged and ultimately debunked if it isn't true. It needs to be, people, they don't want to go near it.
Challenge accepted. This is Raka Ali, and if you don't know him, I recommend you check out his videos. Don't worry, they are just harmless musical parody videos, which are totally safe for work, absolutely politically correct, and not at all gay. Lately, he also started to talk about his politics, and came out as an objectivist, someone who lives by Ayn Rand's philosophy. Like other objectivists, he complains that Rand's philosophy isn't taken seriously by the academy, and he is right about that. I've never seen any professor taking her seriously, and I myself never paid attention to her and always regarded her as a poor man's Nietzsche. But I know what it feels like to be ignored by the academy, so, being the stand-up philosopher that I am going to grant Raka his wish, and debate Ayn Rand. In this video I shall discuss only Ayn Rand. I am not familiar with any other objectivist writings, and if objectivist philosophy has dealt with the arguments I am going to make against her, you are welcome to present them in the comments. Objectivism has become more visible lately, joining us in the fight to protect the values of the free world. I'm talking mainly about Yaron Brook, the chairman of the board of the Ayn Rand Institute, who has been very active on the subject, and on the way is also promoting Rand's philosophy in a very eloquent and upright way. Brook is not a philosopher, and he shows how Rand's philosophy can be useful even for the layman. Watching his videos helped me understand her appeal. One thing that Raka, Yaron and I have in common is that we were all born in Israel. However, while I stayed here, they now live in the States. In other words, they are not based enough in their Israelism. They need a based Israeli to come and show them how to read Ayn Rand. This is what I intend to do in this video. Ayn Rand was born in Russia in 1905 as Alisa Zinovievna Rosenbaum. As a teenager she experienced the communist revolution and, being the daughter of a Jewish middle-class family, felt the decline in quality of life that came with it. From an early age she began to write and show her creative and free-thinking side, and it was obvious that she won't survive for long under a totalitarian regime. Her family worked to get her out, and at age 20 she was granted a visa to travel to America. Once she saw the skyline of Manhattan, the marvel of human ingenuity, she knew that she'll never go back. She got a job in Hollywood, writing screenplays for movies, and in 1936 she published her first novel, portraying the horrors of the world she escaped in Russia. She wrote more novels, which culminated in her magnum opus, Atlas Shrugged, published in 1957. Meanwhile, her fans began to form clubs, and lauded her as an important thinker. The philosophy of life that was presented in the books was adopted by many people, and objectivism became a movement. Rand began to publish articles that expanded on her philosophy, until her death in 1982. To prepare for this video, I read any of her writings I could lay my hands on, but while doing so, I realized that all of her philosophy is actually presented in one place, and that is John Galt's speech in Atlas Shrugged. So in the first part of the video, I'll do a philosophical analysis of the speech, while using her articles as reference. In the latter part I will review her books, and I'll try not to spoil too much. In the end, I will present my final verdict, my updated view of her philosophy. John Galt's speech comes at a moment when human civilization seems to be at the verge of collapse, and he speaks to it as its savior. He begins his speech by saying that humans have been blaming themselves for the crisis, because they fail to live up to their lofty moral values. But actually, it is these very moral values that have brought it to collapse, and to save humanity, they need to change their values. Galt claims that he is the first to make this argument, but it is actually pretty much what Nietzsche said 7 decades before him, and, as we shall see, this is not where the similarities end. Galt says that the only choice humans had until now was between a morality based on man being subservient to God, or a morality that replaced God with society, and demanded of man to be subservient to the good of the collective. Again, this reminds us of Nietzsche. Nietzsche argued that Christian morality was based on meekness and compassion, demanding of man to repress his selfish drives and his individual pride, and to care for his fellow humans, if he wants to get to heaven. Modern thinkers, he blamed, got rid of God, but instead of creating moral values fit for an atheist man, they kept the old Christian values and gave them secular form, resulting in movements like socialism, utilitarianism, and more. However, while Nietzsche defines it as a modern development, something that began in the 19th century, Galt characterizes the entire history of Western thought along these lines. He claims that the debate has always been between religious mystics and secular materialists, and that both agreed that morality is based on the repression of human individuality. Now this is a straw man. Most moral systems created by Western thought actually revolve around the question of how to ensure individual happiness. Western philosophers generally assume that the nature of man is selfish, and create moral systems designed to direct this selfishness to positive avenues, not to suppress it altogether. It is true that in Rand's time there was a rise in collectivist morality, but the influence of the more individualistic philosophies was still there. Galt will later return to this subject and expand on it, and then we shall get deeper into it. Galt now turns to talk about the basis of the alternative ethics that he is proposing. I think that this part is better presented in a speech that Rand herself gave in 1961, titled The Objectivist Ethics, so let's look at what she has to say. Rand opens by claiming that most philosophers regarded ethics as belonging to the province of the whims, that is, of the irrational. Again, this is a total straw man. Most moral systems are based on rationality. You can roughly divide Western philosophy into three camps: those who believe our irrational side is bad, and our rationality must impose a code of morality on it. Examples would be Hobbes and Kant. Those who believe that our rational side is good, and our rationality must create an ethics based on it. Examples would be Rousseau and Nietzsche. And those who believe that our rational side contains both good and bad, and our rationality must direct the good to overcome the bad. Examples would be Plato and Hume. But Rand characterizes all of these ethics as based in irrationality. We shall later try to figure out why that is. After she characterizes existing ethics in such a way, Rand presumes to offer an alternative, a rational, objective, and scientific answer to the question of why man needs a code of values. Once we answer this question, we can create a rational and objective ethics. She begins by pointing out that only living beings can have values, and asks, what does empirical research show us about the nature of living beings? Well, it shows us that every function of an organism is designed to preserving the life of that organism. So, the preservation of one's own life is the highest value, the one all other values should be derived from. In that, Rand believes that she has established a rational and objective basis for an ethical code. This argument can be contested. For instance, one can make the case that the functions of an organism are designed to preserve the species, not the individual organism. But I'm not going to dwell on it. Based on what she has established, Rand declares that the standard of value of the objectivist ethics, the standard by which one judges what is good or evil, is man's life, or that which is required for man's survival qua man. This is a step further. It's not enough for man to just survive. He has to survive as a man. That is, as a man ought to be. In Rand's philosophy, man has a purpose, which his ethics must strive to fulfill. Now that is not something that can be derived empirically, just by looking at nature. The claim that man has a purpose is a metaphysical claim. So how does Rand justify it objectively? Well, her argument is that while other animals can survive on instinct, man, in order to survive, must employ his reason. Therefore, she concludes that the purpose of man is to act as a rational being. And, like many philosophers from Aristotle onwards, she believes that man can be happy only if he lives according to his purpose. Therefore, once she supposedly discovered what man's purpose is, she determines that only a rational existence can lead to happiness. This is not a convincing argument. It is true that man needs reason to survive, but he also needs his instincts, and all the other irrational faculties. Even if you argue that rationality is more important, that still does not lead to the conclusion that man has an innate purpose to act rationally, and that this is the only way of life that will make him happy. Rand acknowledges that some people are driven more by their irrational side, but calls them mental parasites, who survive only thanks to those who employ rationality. But the counter-argument can be that the survival of the species is dependent on such people as well, as they provide things that are essential to the well-being of the human race. To me, Rand fails to objectively establish her argument about the purpose of man. Next, Rand points out that rational thought is a matter of choice. Most people live their life just imitating others, going with the flow, acting as they were taught. But they all have the ability to start employing their own rationality, and come up with their own thoughts. This is something that many philosophers talked about, and some of them even defined the essence of freedom as the act of thinking freely. It's an idea that was particularly developed by the existentialists, at the time when Rand was developing her own thought. But, while those previous philosophers accepted that most people will remain in their semi-conscious state, Rand's ethics demand it of everyone. Humans, she says, have the responsibility to think for themselves. This is a pretty radical idea, and it is very doubtful whether Rand isn't demanding too much of the human race. Let's go back to Galt's speech. He now presents the basic axiom of Rand's philosophy. Existence exists. If you accept this axiom, he says, it implies two corollary axioms. One, that this existence contains your consciousness, which has accepted the axiom. And two, that this consciousness is perceiving an existence which exists outside of it. He then uses semantics to prove this argument, but the argument fails. The fact is that there have been many philosophers, in both Western and Eastern philosophy, who presented a coherent worldview in which all that exists is consciousness, and the so-called objective reality is just the content of it. You need more than a play of words to prove them wrong. But the position that the objective reality does exist is a stronger one. So let's move on. Galt now presents Aristotle's law of identity. A is A. What this means, at least in the way Rand interprets it, is that everything in existence has an identity, comprised of a set of characteristics, and that thing is identical to the set of characteristics that comprise it.
So she starts off by saying, reality is what it is. Nature is out there. It's independent of our consciousness. And in this, she goes to Aristotle. A is A.
This table is here.
This table is here, and we can measure its dimensions, and we can understand it scientifically, and it is.
So this table is here, and it is comprised of characteristics that can be scientifically measured. What Brooke doesn't mention here is that it also has other characteristics, which cannot be scientifically measured. For instance, its purpose. A table is a thing that is designed for a certain purpose, and that purpose is also part of its identity. It would not be a table without it. And, to remind you, Rand believes that man, too, has a purpose. So, if you accept that you exist, and you accept that A is A, then you must conclude that you are you. And since you are a thing with a purpose, then to be true to yourself, to live without self-contradiction, you must strive to achieve that purpose. I don't like the idea that man has a purpose. A table has a purpose, but a table is not a thing of nature. It is man-made. It has a creator. To suggest that man has a purpose is to suggest that man is a tool, made by a creator. Within the frame of atheist thought, I find this idea to be oppressive and dehumanizing. If you want me to elaborate on this point, check out this video. But Galt says that man is man, and must therefore live according to man's purpose. This can only be achieved by acquiring knowledge. Knowledge is gained by the use of human reason, which has the ability to understand reality.
And we have the ability to know the table, right, is here. Use our senses in our mind. So our reasoning capacity tells us about the world.
So Rand believes that the human mind has the capacity to grasp reality as it is, and understand it. What does this belief rely on? Well, throughout the ages, and especially in the Age of Enlightenment, the philosophers who made this claim relied on one thing: the idea that the human mind is made by God, and God made us capable of understanding reality. But Rand is an atheist thinker, so she cannot rely on this answer. And yet, she asserts that our consciousness grasps reality as it is, and that our reason can understand it. Well, what I have to say to that is that it could be true. Her position is a valid position, but it is not a rational position. For an argument to be rational, it has to follow logically from previous arguments. Rand believes that she proved that existence exists, that we have a consciousness that perceives this existence, and that existence is made of things that have a distinct identity. But to get from that to the next step, her claim that our consciousness is capable of grasping the identity of those things still requires a leap of faith. It is possible to come to a different conclusion. I, for instance, believe that my consciousness is the product of evolution, and evolved in a way that is most beneficial for my survival on the crust of planet Earth. It is possible that it perceives existence as it is, but it is also entirely possible that it does not, and that it will break down if it has to deal with another part of the universe. The certainty which Rand attaches to her argument is unfounded. Rand and her followers like to claim that Immanuel Kant, and the philosophers that came after him, abandoned reason when they determined that we don't know if we perceive reality as it is, and that she is reconstituting reason by going back to the position of the philosophers of enlightenment. It is actually the other way around. Kant and his successors, after losing certainty in God's existence, realized that with that we have also lost the certainty in our ability to perceive reality as it is. And so, they took the rational position of remaining agnostic about it, and then attempted to provide a framework in which reason can still operate. Rand, by claiming certainty where there isn't one, has abandoned reason, and replaced it with blind faith. The next step Galt makes is to tell us how reason gains knowledge of reality. Rand develops this part in a book called Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, which is very much in the tradition of Aristotelian thought. I am going to linger on just one point to show how simplistic her epistemology is. Rand talks about the process of classification. We see a table, our reason understands its characteristics, and we learn to identify these characteristics with the table. So when we see another object with the same characteristics, we will know to identify it as another table. This second table will probably have different characteristics, but after seeing several tables, our mind learns to identify the characteristics that are essential to a table. So when we see a new object, we will know to classify it as a table or as something else. Thus, if we are told, put the salt on the table, we will know which object in the room we are supposed to put the salt shaker on, even if we were never in this room and never saw this table. Alright, now, let me ask you this. Is this a table? No, this is a rock. But let's say we are having a picnic, and we use this rock to put things on. I tell you, put the salt on the table, and you put the salt shaker on this rock. How did you know what I meant, even though it's not a table? Well, because we've created the context in which this rock functions as a table. So, the thing that made it a table is not its intrinsic characteristics, but rather the result of something external to it. You might say, actually, the rock does have characteristics that can classify it as a table. It is a solid object that you can place things on, and this is the essence of tables. Alright, so now let me ask you, what is this? Well, this is a table. You can't place solid things on it, and yet it is a table. It is the periodic table of elements. And, again, it is called a table because it has something in common with this table, in that they are both tabular objects. But what do this and this have in common? If classification happens in the way Rand says it does, what is it that made us use the same term for both of them? Now let's say that I ask you to find sodium on the table. You will look at the periodic table and tell me that you found it at number 11. And if I ask you to find gold on the table, you will tell me it's at number 79. And if I ask you to find salt on the table, you will not be able to find it, until I tell you, no, I meant the salt on this table. But you never thought to look there, because at that moment, we've created the context in which this is not a table. There are many other such games, to show that the process is a lot more complicated than Rand says it is. Rand seems to think that if we all employ our reason, and use it to create our concepts, we will be able to form a language which will represent reality as it is, and then we will have a common and truthful basis to communicate with each other. But the human mind and the human language are a lot more flexible than that, and that is necessary because reality is also too diverse to be captured so neatly in human language. This flexibility allows us to usually understand one another, but sometimes it breaks down. Sometimes I have to explain to you what I mean when I say find the salt on the table. And this is another thing to remember. When language and reason break down, it's not the end of the story. We can continue the conversation until we find common ground which enables us to understand each other. But Rand refuses to be part of the conversation. She believes that if we deny that reason can fully understand reality, it means that we reject reason and reject reality, that we are saying this is not a table, or this table does not exist. In fact, the history of philosophy is a history of looking for a common ground that will allow all of us to agree that saying this table is here is a true statement. There are certain caveats that we need to agree on, and sometimes philosophers realize that we need to add another caveat, but at the end of the day, we always find a way to save reason and put it back on solid ground, a ground that will allow all of us to agree that this table is here. There is no major philosopher, as far as I'm aware, who is anti-reason. And that, my dear Raka, is why academics don't take Ayn Rand seriously. All of the philosophical arguments she makes have been around, in some form or another, for thousands of years, and during those years, there have been many objections made against them. The objections I raised in this video are just a smidgen of them. A philosopher that presents a new philosophical system is supposed to deal with all the existing philosophical knowledge, and show how their philosophy solves all the problems and overcomes all the objections. But Rand doesn't bother to defend her arguments against any of these objections. Instead, she mischaracterizes and belittles Western philosophy, and acts as if she is breaking new grounds that no one traversed before. That doesn't mean that her arguments are wrong, but it does mean that we don't have to accept them. We already know that there are other ways to think about the subject, and she doesn't show us why her way is better. So, unless you feel an affinity to her way of thinking, you can just ignore her.
I'd like to see objectivism be challenged and ultimately debunked if it isn't true.
Yeah, we generally don't debunk philosophical systems, Raka. Unless the philosophy in question has some major self-contradictions, it is allowed to exist along the other philosophical systems. As far as I can tell, Rand's thought isn't self-contradictory. Her philosophy has many problems and inconsistencies, but that is true of every other philosophy as well. No human has ever devised the perfect philosophical system. What I am debunking here is some of Rand's pretensions, like that she has created an objective ethical code, or that she is the voice of reason in an anti-reason philosophical field. But after we've determined all that, there is still her philosophy to deal with. So let's continue with John Galt's speech. Galt now presents the idea that humans are born as an emotional blank slate, and that emotions are a result of the values that our rational mind chooses. This is a pretty radical position, which displays Rand's fanatical devotion to rationality. Philosophers generally agree that we are born with both a rational and an irrational side, and the question is how to combine the two. Rand seems to suggest that the irrational is secondary, an outcome of our rationality. So if we develop our rational mind correctly, our emotional world will be healthier and happier. I agree that we can positively affect our emotional world if we adopt wholesome values, but not with the idea of the emotional blank slate. I think it's closer to how Aristotle perceives it, where you are born with a certain range of emotions, and need to use your reason to shape your character and find the optimal point in that range. Rand's position is hard to defend. This idea of the emotional blank slate is derived from the law of identity. Rand believes that man is a subject, an entity. This entity has to be identical to itself. It can't be something else. A cannot be not A. Therefore, she can't accept the notion that man has self-contradictory forces within himself, like a subconscious that resists consciousness, or an emotional side that is in conflict with the rational side. But let me suggest an alternative. It is possible that man is actually made of several contradictory elements, and it is only our mind that imposes a sense of unity on all of these elements, what we call a self, and believes that it is one entity, a subject. Maybe man is not an A. Maybe he is A plus B plus C, etc., and he only perceives himself to be A. In that case, Rand's argument collapses. Next, Galt expands more about Rand's ethics, and we find that he is a Nicomachean ethics, meaning that these are not ethics that are about obeying laws of do's and don'ts, but about using your reason to achieve inner harmony. The idea is that once you achieve inner harmony, you are liberated of the urge to harm and exploit other people, and become a good person. You also become a happy person, so you make life better for those around you. This is the type of ethics that were espoused by the likes of Plato, Aristotle, Epicurus, the Stoics, Spinoza, the existentialists, and others. The closest philosopher, once again, is Nietzsche. But while Nietzsche uses reason to shape his own spirit, Galt talks about using it to shape nature. Man achieves his purpose when he uses his faculties for productive work, which liberates him from his need to conform to nature, and instead transforms nature into products that can benefit him. A virtuous man is someone who lives a rational life, uses reason for innovation and productive work, and then trades the product of his labor with other productive people. Such a man feels pride in his actions, has a sense of self-worth, and thus achieves inner harmony and happiness. Galt makes the point that his philosophy pursues happiness, whereas his rivals only want to eliminate suffering. This is an important distinction. There were indeed many thinkers who believed that the ultimate goal should be the elimination of suffering. The first philosopher I've seen making this distinction is Cicero, in his argument against Epicurean philosophy. Epicurus believed that happiness is equal to the elimination of suffering, but Cicero points out that this only leads to a neutral state, and above it there's a state of happiness. So yes, Epicurean materialism, as well as much of Christian thought, does equate happiness with elimination of suffering, and they comprise the materialists and spiritualists which Galt will now argue against. But there have also been many thinkers who had Cicero's position, and Rand's portrayal of all of Western philosophy as holding the other position is yet another straw man. Galt now attacks Western philosophy for telling man that he is consisted of two entities, body and soul, and that they are at odds with each other. Much like Nietzsche, he shows how this leads to the depletion of the human spirit, and to misery. He argues that man is actually one unit, which is working without self-contradiction. But he doesn't explain how exactly this unit works. Elsewhere, Rand defines man as body with a consciousness, but she doesn't explain how a body made of dead matter can have a consciousness. A philosopher who rejects the matter-spirit dualism, and presents a monistic view instead, must explain how it produces inanimate bodies on the one hand, and a thinking consciousness on the other. Once again, Rand just circumvents the issue when she encounters a difficult philosophical question. That's not how you do philosophy. The outcome of the body-soul split, says Galt, is that we get two kinds of teachers of the morality of death: the spiritualists and the materialists. Both of them, he says, demand that you surrender your mind. The spiritualists want you to surrender it to their revelations, the materialists to your reflexes. Both want you to submit to an ideal that is beyond you and you can't understand. The spiritualists to the will of God, the materialists to the good of society. Both of them want you to devote yourself to the good of the collective, positing self-sacrifice and altruism as the highest values. And both tell you that your reward will be in something that is beyond your life. The spiritualists promise paradise in the afterlife, the materialists promise that your grandchildren will live in utopia. And so, no one lives for their own happiness, and everyone expects others to do for them. The Western morality of altruism, says Galt, led to a society where people exploit each other. Again, this very much mirrors Nietzsche's portrayal of Christianity, and of the 19th century atheist thinkers who kept adhering to the Christian moral values. But Galt talks like these are the only two choices Western culture ever offered, and that's another straw man. The Judeo-Christian tradition does indeed put a lot of emphasis on compassion, but philosophers usually begin with the idea that man is selfish, and must use reason to learn how to combine self-interest with the fact that he lives in a society. Compassion, for most philosophers, is just one element in the moral system. There are even quite a few influential philosophers who maintain that compassion has no place within a moral system, and it should be only about reason. Just off the top of my head I can name Epictetus, Spinoza, Kant, and, most aggressively, Nietzsche. There's no basis for Galt's claim that traditional morality is all about altruism. Galt now turns to attack the philosophy of becoming. Ever since the 5th century BC, Western philosophy was an argument between two camps. On the one camp are the philosophers of being, those who claim that reality is made of entities, and our mind perceives these entities. There is a table here, and even if something happens to the table, like if its leg gets broken, it is still the same table. On the other camp are the philosophers of becoming, those who claim that reality is just an ever-changing chaos, and it is our mind that stamps images on it and calls them entities. What we have here is a reality that is constantly moving and changing, but our perception is unable to see the change, and perceives a stable entity that we call a table. Galt attempts to debunk the philosophy of becoming by arguing that in order for there to be a change, there must first be an entity that can change, but this claim is true only from the perspective of the philosophy of being. This belief that you can so easily settle a philosophical debate that has been raging on for 2500 years just shows, once again, how unserious Rand is as a philosopher. Galt then claims that the philosophy of becoming leads to collectivism, while the philosophy of being leads to individualism. Again, nonsense. It is true if the philosophers you think of are Aristotle and Hegel, but Marx is a philosopher of being and a collectivist. Nietzsche is a philosopher of becoming and an individualist. It isn't as simple as Rand would like it to be. The entire way in which Rand characterizes the conflict between individualism and collectivism is all wrong. If we go back to Plato's Republic, we find that he starts with the idea that the perfect state will be made in the image of the virtuous man. If that is true, then the totalitarian state that he envisions will also be the best place for the individual to flourish. This is also the idea at the basis of the philosophy of modern collectivists, like Rousseau, Hegel and Marx. The idea is not to erase the individual and impose a collective mind. The idea is that if we work as a collective, we can create a state that will be ideal for the individual. I believe that this idea is wrong, and we should fight against it, but in order to do so, we first need to understand and define it correctly. Rand's mischaracterization is a detriment to this fight. I also reject Rand's claim that there is no such thing in nature as collective consciousness, and it is something that is imposed on us. Every human is an individual, but there are also similarities between them, and because of that, one idea can appeal to many minds. Those who are attracted to the idea then form a group identity, and develop it collectively. The trick is to find the right balance between individualism and collectivism. Individual freedom doesn't require you to stay away from any group. It means that you are free to join only the groups that you want to join, and leave when you want to leave. Rand makes the point that we don't have a collective stomach, and everyone needs to eat on his own. She extrapolates from that to argue that any kind of collectivism is ungrounded in human nature. But this analogy is false. When it comes to feelings, for instance, we often share our emotions. We can empathize with what someone else feels, and often it makes us feel the same way. In short, we are not isolated beings who deal with each other just out of self-interest. At its basis, collectivist thinking is rooted in human nature. It is only when it is made into an ideology that it might become totalitarian. But Rand makes it seem like the choice is between becoming a collective where there is no place for individual thought, or her own ethics of what she calls rational selfishness, in which everyone lives for their own self-interest. She argues that if people adopt her ethics, reason will show them that their self-interest is best served when living in a society where everyone is free to think, innovate, produce and trade, and so they will stay within their boundaries and refrain from harming, oppressing and exploiting others. The thing that Rand seems to forget is that such ethics can work only within a capitalist system, where everyone is already socialized to think like capitalists. It is the ingenuity of the human mind that has produced such an economic system, a system that brings into account man's selfish nature and uses it for society's benefit. The thinkers who devised it didn't think selfishness is a virtue, but a fact of life that has to be brought into account. Arguing that selfishness is a virtue in itself, as Rand does, and teaching people that they should be selfish, might lead to problems, which we shall tackle when we discuss her novels. Before we get to the novels, though, let's summarize her philosophy. Ayn Rand is a philosopher of being, who believes that reality is made of human subjects and material objects. Based on Aristotle's law of identity, she rejects the idea that an entity can have inner contradictions, so she rejects the notion that a human subject can have contradicting forces working in it, such as body versus soul, rationality versus irrationality, or consciousness versus subconscious. Instead, she posits that man is a body with a consciousness, capable of thought and reason. The irrational and subconscious side is the result of what man does with his rational and conscious side. To be happy, Man should live out his purpose, which is to be a thinking and productive being. For that, man needs to choose to think for himself, to employ his reason, to act by his own self-interest, and to use his faculties to work on nature and produce products that will benefit him. Then, he can trade these products with other productive humans, and everyone benefits. To maintain this way of life, we need to preserve a liberal democracy with laissez-faire capitalist economics. If we act in this way, our irrational and subconscious side will also be wholesome, and everyone will be happy. It's a very simple and simplistic philosophy, which can be understood even by the layman. At this point in time, when reason, individualism, liberalism, capitalism and democracy are all under attack, Rand's work is a powerful antidote. I can see why objectivism has become more visible, and how it can have a positive effect on the public debate. My biggest problem with Rand is her fanaticism. Because she believes that a thought represents an objective truth, she rejects the work of every other thinker. The only philosopher she sees merit in is Aristotle, and that's because he opened the way to her. Any deviation from her truth, like the idea that the physical reality is not all there is and there's a higher realm, or that reality is becoming and not being, or that the irrational and subconscious sides of man have an existence of their own, or that there is room for collectivism beside individualism, is regarded by her as moral corruption. So she doesn't believe that such ideas can also be the basis for liberal ways of thinking, and contends that they all lead to collectivist totalitarianism. As a result, she is alienated to the world around her. She believes that the United States is the greatest country ever, but since almost no one in it thinks like her, she is constantly in fear that it is about to collapse into a totalitarian state. And she has a similar effect on her followers. Because many of them didn't study philosophy, they believe the strawman that she made of it, and don't bother to read other philosophers. And so, they also become alienated, and fearful that the forces of totalitarianism are winning. If you are inspired by Rand, more power to you, but my advice to you is to have other books on your shelf. Speaking of books, let's turn to Rand's fictional work. Now, the first thing you notice about all of Rand's novels is that they are, essentially, romance novels. There is always a beautiful and rebellious female heroine, who is highly intelligent and wants to succeed in a man's world. She is chased by all the men, but she turns them all away in contempt, because they are a bunch of sniveling collectivists. But then she meets a real man, an individualist, someone who lives by his own rules, and he ravishes her and turns her into his little woman. And then she meets another real man, and finds herself in a love triangle, where she has to decide whether she's on team real man A or team real man B. And between all that, there's also some story about the human spirit. I'm making fun, but I actually like this part. One of the reasons why Rand is being ignored by the intellectual elite, besides her politics, is their snobbery. Because her fiction and her philosophy are so populist, they don't want to even grant her a place on the bookshelf. But I, as you know, idolize pop culture, and I love that Rand is a philosopher that worked in Hollywood, and that she's using the romance novel format to promote her philosophy. As a popular writer, she is excellent, and I read all of her novels long before I decided to make this video. She is a very good storyteller, and she has the knack to get you hooked right away, and keep you in suspense until the end, and her stories are highly inspirational. One of the reasons I explore pop culture is that I believe that the capitalist system is the best system, but also that it is somewhat lacking in spirituality. Pop culture is the result of artists expressing their spirituality and aesthetics within the capitalist system, without trying to escape it, and therefore is the ideal culture. Rand, on her part, attempted to express the spirituality of capitalism, and while I consider her to be a philosophical lightweight, that doesn't mean that her philosophy can't grow. If objectivists who are better educated clean her philosophy of its pretensions, and then take her basic ideas and criticize them in order to make them better, they might end up giving her philosophy more gravity. Her first book is called We the Living, and it has autobiographical elements. It is about a young woman and her middle-class family, and their struggle to survive in Russia after the revolution. Rand does a very good job at transferring the dehumanization and despair that come with living in a communist society. In many ways, this book preempts George Orwell's 1984. that was published over a decade later. Rand is not as good a writer as Orwell, but she earns her place on the shelf beside him. There is also a crucial difference between them. While Orwell is pessimistic and believes that the spirit of man can be totally crushed, Rand is optimistic about the nature of man. One of the key lines in 1984 is "We are the dead," conveying Orwell's pessimism. But Rand's book is called "We the Living," and it expresses her belief that there is a core in human nature that will always resist the attempts to place it under the boot of tyranny. The book's descriptions of daily life in 1920s Russia feel very authentic, and give us a sense of what it was like for the common people. I mentioned before that Rand mischaracterizes collectivist philosophers like Marx, and doesn't realize that their collectivism is ultimately meant to be at the service of the individual. But we get the sense why she sees it this way when we read this book. Most Russians, naturally, didn't fully internalize Marxist-Leninist thought, but lived a life that was a combination of Marxism and Orthodox Christianity, creating a disastrous mix of Christian meekness and Marxist collectivism, which left no place for individualism. And the people in power, naturally, didn't live by Marxist ideals, but became corrupt very fast and used Marxist dogmas to repress those who had a mind of their own. When you read about the reality that Rand witnessed, you gain a better understanding of why she was so afraid of any form of collective thinking. Even in Rand's debut novel, we already see the human archetypes that will populate her future novels. It is basically collectivists versus individualists, but there are several types. There are those who are collectivist in spirit, and live only through the eyes of others. They are like fish in water in a collectivist society, but their nature tells them that something is wrong about this life. There are those who wish to advance by exploiting others, and find that collectivist thought is perfect for their means. And there are those who understand the true nature of collectivist thought, realize that it is about exploitation and oppression, and use this knowledge to gain enormous power. On the individualist side, there are those who try to maintain their individuality, but are not strong enough to stand against the collectivist machine, and end up either conforming or getting crushed. There are those who are individualist in spirit, but buy into the collectivist ideology, and when they realize their mistake it is too late. There are individualists who try to game the system, play the collectivist game as a way of expressing their individuality, but eventually realize that they have sold their soul. Finally, there are those who refuse to bend, and remain true to themselves to the very end. In her subsequent novels, these archetypes become so distinct that the characters become one-dimensional, and don't feel like real people. Here, it still feels like we are reading about human beings, and the story is very humane and moving.
And the meek shall inherit the earth.
The novel was published in 1936 to mixed reviews. The intelligentsia wasn't ready yet for a book that denigrated Soviet Russia and collectivist thought, and it didn't sell much. Rand then started to work on her next novel, which took her a few years to write, and in the meantime she wrote a short novella called Anthem, which she completed in one summer. Anthem is a book about a future dystopia in which collectivist thought had won completely. Individuality has been erased, to the point where people don't even have words to express it. As a result, humanity basically recedes back into the Stone Age, in terms of knowledge and material means. But, once again, we see that human nature resists this reality, and demands to be true to its selfish character. The protagonist revolts, and rekindles the human mind and spirit. Anthem is another good story, another powerful warning against the dangers of collectivism. It was published in England in 1938, but in the States it was rejected by the publishers, and it took another 8 years until it finally came out. The reason that it was eventually published was that in the meantime, Rand finally finished her next novel. Once again she had to struggle to get it published, but in 1943 it finally saw light, and Rand became a sensation. Fountainhead is, without question, Rand's most inspiring work. and Rand, at her best, is nothing if not inspiring. While the heroes of We the Living were fighting a hopeless battle against collectivism in Russia, here the odds are even, as the arena is shifted to the United States, where our heroes are fighting to save the American spirit against the encroaching forces of collectivism. The main protagonist is a New York architect, who refuses to conform to the aesthetical and ethical ideals of the collective mind, but builds according to his own vision.
Stumping along on this big Philip Johnson. This delay just wasting my time. Looking across at Richard Rogers. Scheming dreams to blow.
It is basically a story of good versus evil, and fine literature isn't supposed to be this black and white. But Rand is an ideologue, and she knows how to get the reader on her side. The book is a heroic and triumphant monument to the greatness of man, as he imposes his spirit on the world.
All the majesty of a city landscape. All the soaring days in our lives. All the concrete dreams in my mind's eye. All the joy I see through this architect's eyes.
In this book, Rand starts to develop her ethics. She focuses here on the individualist as a creator, someone who uses his mind to conquer nature, and thus is beneficial to his fellow men. His existence is one of freedom, innovation, creation, determination, and willpower. The collectivist, on the other hand, is what she calls a second-hander. He is not about conquering nature, but about conquering other humans. He doesn't create anything useful, but wants to annex what the individualists create. Thus, he devised the ethics of altruism, aimed to steal the fruits of the creator's labor and hand them to those who don't work for themselves. The second-handers cannot survive on their own. They can only live as parasites in a society where the individualists do all the work. As we've already discussed, this is a highly simplistic view. Rand displays a very simplistic view of our aesthetics as well. She implies that there is a right way to build a building, and that collectivist thought is censoring it and imposing wrong ways. The right way is to build rationally, based on the ground conditions and the needs of the residents. But if artists were creating only rationally, we would never get anywhere. The greatness of art is that it transcends rationality, expresses something that we cannot express in words. We experience it, but we can't explain it, at least not at first. Eventually we find the words to explain it rationally, and we learn something new about existence. If we went by Ayn Rand's aesthetic criteria, our minds would remain closed forever. Another big problem with the book is that the characters don't feel human. They are one-dimensional archetypes. For Rand, there is only one true way to live your life, and the hero presents it. Everyone else is living various degrees of false existence, because of the effects that collectivist thought has on their minds. If it wasn't for that, I'd like her books much more, because I relate strongly to her heroes. The thing that gives me the most happiness is creating according to my vision, and I refuse to compromise it even as the world failed to give me recognition. All I have to show for it so far is a YouTube channel with a few thousand subscribers. But I don't blame it on the notion that the minds of people have been poisoned by some ideology that prevents them from realizing my greatness. I accept that humanity is diverse, and my work is not for everyone. If I believe in a free society, I also have to accept its diversity, and reconcile with its negative manifestations. Rand's fanatical belief that she can objectively define what is virtuous and what is beautiful is, I believe, at odds with her belief in a free society. Fountainhead was slammed by most critics when it came out. At the time when the free world was fighting the fascists, Rand's superhumanly heroes were irksome to many. For the left, her celebration of capitalism was, and still is, an anathema. But among the general public there were many who were inspired by the free and heroic spirit of the novel, and it became a bestseller. Rand was now a famous author, and could take her time to work on her final offering to the world of literature. In 1957 she finally completed it, and Atlas Shrugged was sent into the world, giving her philosophy a fully fleshed form. It is a monumental book, at least in terms of its size, and one reason for it is that it is too preachy and long-winded. Rand seems to be in love with her own ideas, and she self-indulges in lengthy monologues and in dialogues so philosophical that even Socrates would be embarrassed to have them. But it's still a great story. The basic narrative is that the productive people finally realize that second-handers are living on their backs, and start to fight back. As I read it again in preparation for this video, it kind of reminded me of our time, with its heroes getting red-pilled one after the other, and understanding the wickedness of the leftist ideology that is ruling their lives. So while Fountainhead had one individual hero fighting against the collectivist system, here there are many. In other words, this time there are more than just two hot objectivist men for a heroine to choose from. It is a real cornucopia for the Randy woman. Rand also provides a utopian vision here, existing in a place called Galt's Gulch, which is a microcosm of an ideal capitalist society. In Galt's Gulch, everyone is doing productive work, and they trade with each other and help each other grow. And yet, I remember that when I read this part for the first time, I was thinking, this is a fucking kibbutz. The kibbutz is an Israeli experiment, a form of a village that is a microcosm of a communist society. So why did Rand's capitalist village remind me of it? Because the kibbutz worked fine, as long as everyone there shared the same ideology. The founding generation were all communists, and they all worked for the good of the collective, and trusted that their comrades were working for it as well. But when the second generation was born, there were those who didn't want to work as hard, and the whole thing fell apart. I can't imagine Galt's Gulch escaping the same fate. It works fine because everyone there is an innovator, capable of producing new products to trade with others. What happens when you get people who don't have that nature? Remember, Rand believes that people achieve their potential in productive work, and that gives them a sense of self-worth, and makes them happy. But if you create a society based on this principle, what will be of those who aren't innovators, and can't produce anything original? They will have to work menial jobs, which don't give you much of a sense of self-worth. How will they find happiness? In our society, they can find their worth by joining a group, but that's not an option in Rand's ideal society. It seems to me that Rand's utopia will contain a lot of miserable people. Another problem with Galt's Gulch is that nothing there is given freely. You have to pay for even the smallest favors. I think a big chunk of happiness is lost because of it. One of the joys of life is to give something to someone because you want to make them happy, not because you want something in return. This is a joy that Rand's ethics don't allow, and this is one of the prices she pays for downgrading the emotional side of man, and denying that shared feelings are integral to his nature. To me, this price is too high. Towards the end of the book, Rand goes overboard. There is a moment in which the heroine kills a man in cold blood. The killing itself can be justified, as she does it to save life, but what is bothersome is how the narrator justifies it. The victim is a young man who refuses to think for himself, and because of that, our heroine has no qualms about killing him. And this is the big deficiency in Rand's ethics of selfishness. It explains very well why you shouldn't harm other productive people, as you mutually benefit from each other. But non-productive people have no benefit for the selfish individual, and I don't see anything in Rand's moral system that forbids you to harm them. This is what fanaticism leads to a point where some people's life have no value in your eyes. This is where Rand's ethics fall apart, and if you choose to be an objectivist, this is one of the aspects of her philosophy that you need to fix. Alright, that is what I had to say about the novels. Before I go, I want to talk about what I consider to be the best thing about Ayn Rand's work, and that is that she has written a philosophy of capitalism. Rand points out, correctly, that capitalism failed to ground itself in philosophical thought. It was developed by economists, who spoke of its materialist benefits, but didn't say how it benefits the human spirit. Some philosophers have agreed that capitalism is the best economic system, but they all searched for the spirituality outside of it. Rand is correct in arguing that this is one of capitalism's biggest weaknesses, the reason why it struggles to defend itself against the attacks of anti-capitalists. In Resistance, Rand manages to quite effectively make you appreciate the beauty and spirituality of capitalism, and helps to red pill you from the ideologies that demonize it. I once made a video called Rehabilitating Spirituality, in which I counted 7 types of ways in which human spirituality expresses itself. Rand provides an 8th type, and that is the spirituality of doing business. The highest attributes of man's spirit, to her, are creative ability, ambitiousness, self-assertiveness, refusal to bear disasters without contesting them, and dedication to the goal of reshaping Earth in the image of his values. If you adopt her spirituality, there's a good chance that you'll become a happy and successful businessman. The downside, once again, is her fanaticism. The attributes I've mentioned are pretty much the only attributes that she counts as good, and she rejects all other attributes. When you deny the human ability to transcendence, when you deny the primacy of the irrational side, when you reject the shared feelings, I'm afraid it might leave you with a rather depleted and impoverished spirit. I'll say it again, if you are drawn to Rand's spirituality, if you feel that the attributes she highlights are the most important ones, by all means, be an objectivist. But make sure to have other thinkers and artists on your shelf who can enrich your spirit beyond that. There's a lot more to be said, but this video is already threatening to become as long as Atlas Shrugged. I think I got the gist of what Rand is about, and I am now prepared to give my final verdict. So, my updated view of Ayn Rand is... poor man's Nietzsche.